All right, guys, welcome to another lesson. I hope you're ready for it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the focus. Our focus for today's lesson is to add and subtract fractions and to solve problems involving fractions. The question that you should be able to answer by the end of this lesson is, how do you explain the process of adding and subtracting fractions that have different denominators? So let's go ahead into the meat and potatoes of this lesson. We're going to take a look at an example of adding and subtracting fractions that have common denominators. Our example here shows that we're finding the sum of 1/8 and 5/8. We're not going to be estimating, we're actually going to be solving these. So what we're going to have to do, whenever we're adding and subtracting fractions, we have to have a common denominator. In this problem, our denominators are already the same, so we're just going to keep the denominator. And we're just going to add our numerators across. We're going to simplify once we add our numerators to equal 6/8. But 6/8 isn't in simplest form because 6 and 8 have other factors in common other than 1. So we're going to divide our numerator and denominator by 2 to equal 3/4. From here, we can confirm that 3 and 4 have no other factors in common except for 1. So the answer and sum of 1/8 plus 5/8 equals 3/4. So let's go ahead and do some together. Here in this first problem, we have 3/5 plus 1/5. We're going to keep the denominator the same because, like I said, when we're adding or subtracting fractions, only with those operations, we have to have a common denominator. So from here, we're just going to add our numerators. 3 plus 1 equals 4. 4 and 5 do not have any other factors in common other than 1, so this fraction is in simplest form. 3/5 plus 1/5 equals 4/5. Next, we are going to find the difference between 13/16 and 9/16. Like I said earlier, in order to add or subtract fractions, we have to have a common denominator, so we're going to keep it the same, which is 16. And then we're going to find the difference between 13 and 9. 13 minus 9 is equal to 4. I can tell right here that this fraction is not in simplest form because it has more than one factor other than 1 that goes into 4 and 16. So I'm going to divide both my numerator and my denominator by 4. 4 divided by 4 equals 1. And 16 divided by 4 equals 4. I can now look at this simplified fraction and confirm that 1 and 4 only have one factor in common, which is 1. So now that fraction is in simplest form. Now we're going to switch gears to looking at adding and subtracting fractions with different denominators. As I've been saying throughout this lesson, that in order to add and subtract fractions, you have to have a common denominator. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example where we're asked to add 4/5 plus 3/3. So we're going to find the LCD, the least common denominator of 5 and 3, which is 15. And we're going to write equivalent fractions. So 4/5, to have a common denominator of 15, we need to multiply the numerator and the denominator by 3. When we do that, we have an equivalent fraction of 12/15. So the equivalent fraction to 4/5 is 12/15 because we have to have a common denominator. Now let's look at this fraction, 2/3. What number do we need to multiply our denominator by to equal 15? That's 5. And what we do to our bottom number, our denominator, we also need to do to our numerator. So we're multiplying 2/3 by 5 to have an equivalent fraction of 10/15. Then we're going to add those numerators because our denominator is going to stay the same, of 15. 12 plus 10 equals 22. Now we have an improper fraction. So solving to see how many times does 15 go into 22? One whole time. And the difference between those two values is 7. So in simplest form, 22/15 equals 1 and 7/15. And that is in simplest form because 7 and 15, our numerator and denominator, only have one factor in common, and that is the number 1. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. So for our first problem, we're asked to find the difference between 4/3 and 1/6. First, we need to find the least common denominator, or the least common multiple of our denominator, which equals 12. So we need to write an equivalent fraction for both of our fractions. So we have 3/4. We need to multiply that by another fraction so that we have a common denominator of 12. 4 times 3 is equal to 12. So we're also going to multiply our numerator times 3. 3 times 3 equals 9. So our equivalent fraction to 3/4 is 9/12. Now we need to write an equivalent fraction to 1/6. 1/6, we need to multiply that by a fraction so that has a common denominator of 12. 6 times 2 equals 12. And what we do to our denominator, we also do to our numerator. So we're going to multiply straight across. 1 times 2 equals 2. Now that we have our equivalent fractions, we can rewrite them and find the difference. We have 9/12 minus 2/12. Our denominator stays the same since we have a common denominator now, and we're just left to find the difference between 9 and 2. 9 minus 2 equals 7. 7 and 12 do not have any other factors in common other than 1, so it is in simplest form. So 3/4 minus 1/6 is equal to 7/12. Let's take a look at our second example. Since our denominators are not the same, we need to write an equivalent fraction of these fractions so that our denominator is the same. Our least common denominator in this case is 14. So this fraction is going to get to stay the same since our denominator is already 14. But we need to write an equivalent fraction to 3/7. So what fraction should we multiply 3/7 by so that our denominator equals 14? So 7 times what number equals 14? Well, that's 2. 7 times 2 equals 14. And what we do to our denominator, we also do to our numerator. So 3 times 2 is equal to 6. So now that we have an equivalent fraction to our first fraction, we can just go ahead and add those. So we have 6/14 plus 5/14. 6 plus 5 is equal to 11, and our denominator stays the same, which is 14. I'm going to take a look here. I have 11 as my numerator, 14 as my denominator. This is in simplest form since 11 and 14 only share one factor in common, and that is 1. We are to the end of our lesson of adding and subtracting fractions, and I'm going to ask you this question once more. How do you explain the process of adding or subtracting fractions that have different denominators? If you're not sure how to answer that question, please review this video and go through those examples. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to let us know. Don't forget to answer the questions below.